So our next speakers, the next talk is going to be another talk about flooding. And this is flooding from Brazil, and we are thrilled to have our Brazilian colleagues with us. They're going to be talking about the early recovery and international and national collaborations in that recovery work. So our two speakers are, oops, sorry, I have to move so our two speakers are Diego Bevilaqua, who graduated in physics from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro and works in science communication and science museums, currently serves as the Deputy Director of Cultural Heritage and Science Communication at Casa de Oswaldo Cruz, part of the Oswaldo Cruz Foundation. And additionally, he is President of ICOM-Brazil and Secretary of the Executive Council of the International Committee for Museums and Collections of Science and Technology. He is also a lecturer in the graduate program in Science, Technology, and Health Communication at Fiocruz. And Dóris Couto, director of the Julio de Castillo's History Museum and coordinator of the State Museum System, a student in history theory and criticism of art. She has a degree in museology from the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul and a master's degree in museology and heritage from the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul. She's a member of the Collection Management Committee of the Piratini Palace and teaches preventive conservation and curating and mounting exhibitions in the specialization of history and collections management at the Institute of Humanities, Science, Education, and Creativity at the University of Passo Fundo. And she also coordinated and guided actions to rescue collections from the floods in Rio Grande do Sul in September 2023 and May 2024. We are absolutely thrilled that you are here today to speak with us, and the floor is yours.
So thank you, Don Rogala. Well, my name, as said, is Diego Vaz Bevilaqua. I'm the chair of ICOM-Brazil. Actually, most of the work we are going to hear about is mostly due to to Dóris Couto, who is here with me. So she just present herself. She is Dóris. She is currently the coordinator of the museum system at the state of Rio Grande do Sul. She actually became the coordinator of the system just a month before the whole situation happened. It was a huge disaster, the worst disaster for heritage in Brazil. And she thanks very much for the opportunity. And now we are going to present a little bit of what we've done and how we coordinate all the things. So before we start, just to give a little bit of context, so we are talking about the state of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil. So it's the southmost state in Brazil. It's kind of the steep, but in the end, it's very close, as you see, to Uruguay and Argentina, that it's on the border of Brazil. And as you can see on this map, there is this huge lagoon, which govern most of the landscape, especially on the east part of the state, because we have some high grounds here on the top. And a lot of rivers flows down from those mountains to this lagoon. And that's mostly where the flood happened. So we are here to present a little bit of the work of rescuing collections and recovery museums that was conducted in the aftermath of a severe flood that happened in the state of Rio Grande do Sul. It was not only in the state of Rio Grande do Sul, it also affected nearborn states as Santa Catarina and also a little bit of Uruguay and Argentina. But the severe part of the flood happened in the state. It actually covered, it was, as you see on the map, almost more than 60% of the state were with several floods during a very short period of time. So it was looked like an endless nightmare when it was happening. In just a week, we were like in a warlike scenario with 323 cities that were affected. And we had around 170 people that were dead and over 500,000 displaced from their homes. So this is a small time frame for you to understand what happened. So the first flood started by the end of April. In the beginning, very concentrated on the valley of Rio Pardo. That's one of the valleys in the region. By the next day, you have severe red alert for rains almost all over the states. By the April 30, we already have 8 deaths, 3 bridges have red collapses, 3 roads were blocked. On 2 May, we had like a historical flood in Porto Alegre and all regions around the Guaíba River and Taquari River, two of the major rivers of the state. The Taquari rivers rise 30 meters. The Guaíba River, that's in Porto Alegre, which is the capital, the state of the capital, rises up to almost 6 meters. In addition to that, even though the city has assistance of tanks and pumps, it didn't work properly. So most of the city, especially downtown, was underwater for a lot of days. This is what happened. You can see in May 30, I mean, mostly of the city was covered in water. On May 8, you have around 96 cities in the state of calamity. On the next day, there is a famous picture from our art museum that's right in downtown. I will show a huge, bigger picture later. It got actually 2 meters of water inside the museum. So by May 10, after almost 2 weeks of nonstop heavy rain, it rained a third of what was expected during the whole year in the state within 2 weeks period. So we had 22 museums and collections that were flooded, and 36 have some kind of damage. We estimate that 8 million documents were affected and 400,000 books were lost. So this is just to give you a little bit of more context. So the lower picture, it's a satellite image of the region around Porto Alegre, and you can see the lagoon and the Guaíba River and some of the rivers that flows to the Guaíba River. And the top picture is the same region, but during the one of the most intense part of the flow, you can see clearly how much the rivers were like was over the surrounding spaces and affecting all neighborhood cities. So this is one of the most iconic image. This is one of the most important museum in the state of Rio Grande do Sul. That's the Museum of Art of Rio Grande do Sul. As you can see below, the first floor was almost completely underwater. It had like 2 meters of water high. It is right in the middle of downtown. So you can see all over the space, there is like water everywhere. So 70% of the artworks in the Art Museum of Rio Grande do Sul were affected. What happened is, even though it's a very important state-owned institution, it's house of several important artists. It turns out that its storage or vault-like storage, which provides excellent protection against theft. However, it had a single door. It was terrible for the evacuation of the works, allowing only one work to pass at a time. As a result, the evacuation was very slowly, and it turns out that during the process of evacuation, the civil defense and the police ordered the whole evacuation of the building because the wall protecting the city was close to fall down, and the city and the museum was close to be flooded by water. So we have to ensure the safety of the 25 people that were doing the evacuation of the artworks. The result was that 4,000 prints in 300 paintings, canvases was directly affected because it was affected by the flood. However, the proper backing of the printings and painting allows this damage to be as minimal as possible, and most of the paintings were saved because it was covered with mold, with microorganisms, and at least 3 types of bacteria. However, it was remained on the outer layer and did not cause major damage except for the watercolors, which were with soluble ink, which were a few, but unfortunately they were lost. There was some deformation of the paper as ripples, and some had small tears when they were removed from the envelope. Also, we have severe flood in our archives. that were greatly affected. For instance, the 4th Federal Court in Porto Alegre had over 80,000 cases, boxes that were underwater, creating a chaotic situation for the rescue due to volume. There was no way to freeze them due to the volume, so the solution was just to open the box, expect them to dry as fast as possible on the floor, and clothesline with interleave with absorbent paper. So in September last year, we have a traumatic experience in the city of Mussum, that's a small town northwest of Porto Alegre. It also had storm rains and a flood, but was localized at this time only to the town due to the rise of the Taquari River. The museum of the town was submerged during the flood. Volunteers were drafted to rescue it. However, they have no previous training or technical knowledge. So unfortunately, when they removed the mood, they threw away a lot of photographic and documentary collection due to underpreparedness of those volunteers, including a lot of museological documentation. So to prevent this from happening again, and this year in all cities affected, the rescue was always coordinated either by the museum, archive, or library system, such a way that volunteer was registered and activated as need and as the location allowed. So we operated through the internet. So we actually have expert WhatsApp group, which was very active and efficient to activate expertise during the whole process. We registered 471 volunteers in Google Form to help on the museum's restoration and rescue of collections. And the archives and library have similar form, which registers 700 people. So we doing that, we guarantee that we know which volunteer we are counting on and how much they have of training and previous knowledge, and activated them from this knowledge base. Well, this is already a talk to. So I would
have about 3 minutes left, just to let you know.
I'm going to the finished part here. Some image of museum that were heavily affected. So you can see this is the floor of the Rio Grande City Museum that was all flooded, and now they moved the collections to upper floor. But the building was completely damaged. Now they have another new building that and they are relocating the museum. This is Igrejinha, another small town. Another one that the water rose very fast overnight. It took doors and windows and affected the whole collection. It is another museum that represents the German immigration. A lot of damage to collection, and they also are the temporary location expecting for relocation of the building. So this is again the Art Museum of Rio Grande do Sul. Most of the documentation that was in the third shelf, they never expected the water to get so high, were also affected. This is another museum in the Visconde São Leopoldo, another one for German immigration. It's mostly instruments, but also another memories of the German immigration. It was a lot of damage, especially to the instruments like pianos and music instruments from the 19th century. It's already, fortunately, it has already got money for the whole restoration of the objects. So to finish, I would like to just say a little bit, how did we coordinate both nationally and internationally the efforts? So not only ICOM-Brazil, but also the Brazilian Institute of Museums, that's a federal agency, work closely together to the museum system of the state of Rio Grande do Sul, such a way that the museum state coordinate all the effort, not only with the museums they owned, but also with all other museums. And we were able to give like not only support, but also coordinate with other states internationally, and even to raise funds for the museum to operate. What important thing is everyone went through the museum system in the state, so we don't have like people colliding with each other, like trying to do things, even though in a good nature. And from ICOM-Brazil, our major responsibility was trying to do some international cooperation and some links between several agencies all over the world. Not only we connected through the Secretariat, 4 international committees from ICOM that give support, the documentation committee, the ICOM-CC conservation committee, the DRMC, that's the disaster management committee, and also ECMS, the museum security. But we also were in contact with the Cultural Emergency Response, the UNESCO Mission Brazil, and also the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative. Both were very responsive. We actually got offers of funds not only from CER, but also from Smithsonian. The Smithsonian, actually, this is an example of the donation we have from Smithsonian. And I was like also to mention briefly before I finished that the UNESCO mission was very important. I think Samuel talked to you before, but we were able to have an on-site mission that trained 60 people in 4 regions for the rescue of the collection. So just to finish with great news, the Museum of Art of Rio Grande do Sul is going to reopen tomorrow, and its collections in the process of being restored. The Museum of Mussum will reopen on the September 10th, and we are very driven to open all the other museums in the state. We still have great challenge ahead, and especially regarding risk management emergency plans, which is still pretty non-existent in most of the local institutions, the government. So this is still a lot of work to do. So thank you. Sorry if it's a minute more.
That is wonderful news that everything's reopening. And I know we have questions piling up for you. We're going to do questions after the next 2 talks. So if you can hang around, just turn off your microphones for the next 2 talks, and we'll go through a bunch of questions. And again, we'll have breakout sessions at the end where everybody can talk to you directly, because I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions about how you manage that organization and that collaboration with all those different groups. So thank you again to both of you.
Thank you.
Overwhelming amount of work. It's really amazing. All right, I'm going to move on to our next speakers. The next talk is about the recovery after the collapse of the City Archive of Cologne. And our speaker is Dr. Ulrich Fischer, is Deputy Director of the Historical Archives of Cologne. Since the collapse of the archive in 2009, he's been in charge of that reconstruction effort. In 2013, he took over as head of the Department on Municipal Records since 1815 and General Archive Policies. That's an interesting department name. He is a member of Blue Shield Germany, and in 2019, he initiated, together with Nadine Thiel, who is not able to be here today, the foundation of the Cologne Emergency Network, in which 24 archives and libraries work together in risk management and disaster prevention. Dr. Fischer, I will hand it over to you, and if you can unmute yourself.
Thank you so much. So just to give you a very, very brief overview about our archive, we pride ourselves on being the largest German municipal archive. I'm not sure if it's true anymore, but we've got a very large collection. We have about 170 people working in the archives, about 35 shelf kilometers, and 60,000 charters and diplomas. So it's a big archive, and it works for a city administration with about 20,000 employees. So there's actually a lot of material coming in each year. Also, we have about 900 estates and collections from photographers, architects, parties, and so on, from the city of Cologne. And to give you a very brief idea about the city of Cologne, I'll jump to the next slide. It's just about 1 million inhabitants. It's in the west of Germany on the River Rhine. Fairly famous for its cathedral, in Germany fairly infamous for the quality of its beer. And we do tourism, education, sports, and culture. And it's a Roman city by founding, so it's about 2,000 years old. But for the archives, the most important period is the Middle Ages and the early modern times, when Cologne was the biggest city in what is now Germany. And so there's a lot of material of cultural importance which is collected in the archives. Cologne at the moment has 22 twin cities, and the latest addition being Dnipro in Ukraine. We pride ourselves in being a very open city. So to just take you through the catastrophe that sort of initiated the recovery process, about which I'm mainly going to talk today. We're now in 2009, to be exact, on the 3rd of March, and something happened that no one would have expected in the middle of the city. The building of the archive, about 6 stories high, containing more than 20 shelf kilometers of archive material, just all of a sudden disintegrated and fell into the street. 2 young men who lived in the house right next to this archive building lost their lives because there was no way they could escape from their flat at the top of this house. And we were, in fact, very fortunate that not very many other people also got hurt in the process. In fact, everybody in the archive and all the people visiting the archive the day escaped unhurt, at least in terms of injuries. That was in the early afternoon of the 3rd of March, and a little later, the pictures that you see on the right were taken. And the one thing that we were quite surprised about was that there was, this building with a lot of paper inside collapses, and there was not very much paper visible. So at the very first hours after the catastrophe, the only thing we really thought about was salvaging the material that was in other parts of the building that still remained standing to the back. And we were thinking about how we're going to talk about Cologne history without a Cologne archive. Fortunately, that was about to change, but let me first show you this very, very old photograph from the time that this building that collapsed was actually first built and opened. So we're in the 1960s, 70s, as you can see from the cars parked in front of it. This building was right beside a new metro line. They were building an underground line right in front of the building. And in the course of this building project, they decided that they had to have a switch between the 2 tunnels that they were building right in front of the building. So they opened up the ground there, worked in it for almost 4 years without anything happening. And then suddenly the soil beneath the archive building gave way, and the archive building more or less broke in 2, and it fell into the street, and the rubble sort of piled up. So we thought there's not very much we can actually do about this, but again, we were quite fortunate. About 2 days in after the catastrophe, the firefighters actually began to find paper, and actually paper in a fairly good condition. And so we started setting up a big rescue operation with a lot of people from the city of Cologne, and actually with a lot of people from all over Europe, experts, archivists, librarians, conservators, who all came to Cologne. And over the next 6 months or so, we started working on what we found. And that was the first response. I'll show you a few more pictures about that, but just to give you an idea of how this entire operation started then and still continuing, I'll give you a brief overview of the different stages. We started, of course, with a salvage and initial treatment of the material. And as I said, I'll show you a few pictures about that. Then we were very happy to find storage facilities for all the material that we were actually able to salvage. We continued with the first phase of identification of the material. We are almost finished with that, so I also put that in brackets. So the entire left side of this slide, those are things that we're more or less done with. But the things that we put on the right-hand side of this slide, conservation, and that is just applies to very basic conservation of the material. We'll still be working on this for the next decades, I imagine. And the same applies to the archival identification. We call this identification phase 2, where we actually try to figure out what kind of items we have salvaged and where do they belong, what is the provenance, what is the archival context. And then finally, of course, we want to digitize all of the collection, and this is also going to take a long time. So as for the salvage, there it was complicated by the fact that the heap of rubble, as well as all the material that fell into this underground building site, was extremely insecure. So nobody was allowed except for professionals. So we'd have firefighters there and members of the Federal Agency for Technical Relief. Those are the people that you see in this picture. They all went in and more or less with their hands, they separated rubble from paper. And they passed on the paper in those white boxes that you may just see in the slide, passed that on to me, my colleagues, and all the people volunteering to actually take care of all the material that they were able to salvage. The first big operation, which in the end led to about 80% of the archive material being salvaged, took almost 6 months, went from early March to end of July 2009, and there were about 800 colleagues from Germany and surrounding countries who helped us with that. And then later on, we were even able to salvage material which had become waterlogged, so it was below 10 meters below the street level. It's a very an area with a very high groundwater level. The river is very close, and a lot of material actually fell into an area where there's water yeah, we were able to salvage a lot of that as well. Some of it even in a quite good state, so that by the end of August 2011, we are quite confident to say we have at least 95%, so around 30 shelf kilometers of archive material. So to give you some impressions about how the initial response went about, you see all the different people from the relief organizations working to find the paper in the rubble. And here you see the volunteers and experts working together to salvage whatever they found in terms of paper, parchment, photos, books, plants, and so on. So the next stage was to differentiate, to have a sort of triage between dry material, which went into initial treatment and then went into ordinary archive storage, and material that was deemed wet or at least moist. And this wet material went into deep freezing. So you can see a picture at the bottom right hand of all the boxes with Cologne archive material in a freezing storage facility not far away. So to take you from the emergency response to recovery, as I said, we have those first three parts, and we actually did a lot of work on those first three steps of our process. And we also said that we are concentrating on those steps that can be done that will have a lot of impact on all of the material. And we'll try to bring all of the material into a state where it can be stored longer. So we're just buying time and we're postponing further restoration measures, which definitely will have to take place. So to give you the basic idea of our recovery process, and we'll talk about 3 parts of it, but actually it comprises a lot of more and some fairly intricate processes in the field of conservation, also in the field of archival identification. But we'll also look at digital reconstruction as well. So,
just letting you know.
Sorry? Oh,
no,
okay.
3 minutes. That's just letting you know there's 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So that is the work that we do as on the archival side. As you may imagine, everything was just completely in disorder. So there's actually a software system helping us to recatalog all of our material. And we also had to invent a whole new way of storing things, which is more like an Amazon way of storing things. It's not the classical archival way, because there's no inherent logic to our storing, but everything is coordinated via barcoded boxes and shelves. And also our conservation processes are quite different from the classic conservation processes that we used to do as archivists and restorers before the collapse. Those processes are mostly being conducted by assistants who are being supervised by conservators. And we have about 20 assistants working only to provide or to work on that material that we need to provide for our reading room. So that's we're working on demand rather than collection by collection by collection. And also we have, in order to coordinate and to manage that, we also had to come up with a software system which takes into account our barcoded logistics system and also our highly specialized work in conservation and the archival field. So that takes us, this kind of specialized work finally takes us to maybe the most sophisticated part, because we also found about 5 to 7 million fragments. And those fragments also need to be put together again, but this is a process that will never happen just by archivists looking at the little fragments, but we need to have software to support this. So we're scanning all the fragments, and we have a reconstruction system which actually virtually puts together the pages. We are very, very happy that this system works as well as we wouldn't have imagined. So the first few thousand pages have been reconstructed from the fragments, and it's we're looking forward to having more and more and more of those. As you can see, sometimes it's quite a lot of different fragments which the system automatically finds and places together. So we want to stick with using high-end technology to support our tasks, because otherwise there's no way we can actually ever finish them. And before leaving you, I want to maybe share some of the lessons we learned. And I'll just read them to you, and because I think that is really what has turned out to be the most important ideas that we came up with in the process. First of all, we're working in mixed teams with experts, assistants, and sometimes even volunteers, and that has been great and has been very, very effective, and we would always do it that way. Then we were extremely lucky because no one has ever created any problems about the funding. This may be to do with the fact that both the companies who were building the metro line had to provide insurance when they were awarded their contract, and also there was an art insurance for the city archives. Then one of the main problems that we have is that the capacities of commercial conservation labs are so very limited. So there's not very many items that can actually be worked on outside our house. What we really learned is that it's worth thinking about decoupling operations. So we have archival operations, we have conservation operations, and we just don't put them together. Even though this may make sense for 1 or 2 or 10 items, it always slows the process if you do it for thousands of items. Then, of course, IT support and investment in technology has really proved to be very, very helpful, as is sharing, communicating, and reusing solutions developed in the community. And finally, if we had consistent machine-readable labeling of all our archive units at the time of the collapse, it would have saved us 12 years of work. So much for that. Thank you very much. And I'll be around for questions.
Yes, they are piling up for you. And I think we've been hearing quite a bit about the idea of cataloging different ways in advance, like changing your cataloging systems in order to make things easier when you get to these kind of disaster situations. But we will have those questions for you after our next talk. So thank you very much. And if you would just stick around for that, that would be great. And the next talk that we're going to have, which will be the last talk before questions, is a talk about another collapse that happened at the Smithsonian during an enormous snowstorm back in 2010, I believe. And a talk will be given by Samantha Snell, who you've been seeing throughout this conference. Ms. Snell has a 24-year career with the Smithsonian Institution, working at the National Air and Space Museum and the National Collections Program, where she improves Smithsonian-wide collections emergency management as chair of the Preparedness and Response and Collections Emergency Committee, which we call PRICE. She supports other priority institutional collections initiatives. She's a member of the Heritage Emergency National Task Force and chair of the ARCS Emergency Subcommittee, and a planning committee member for the Safety and Cultural Heritage Summit. And like this entire conference week, a key part of Samantha's job is striving to help every colleague see themselves as a collections steward, regardless of their title, department, or specialty. And we all know how important that is. Samantha, I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Dawn.
Perfect.
So thank you so much, everybody. And thank you to the planning committee, my fellow committee members, for inviting me to speak with you today. And as I begin, I would like to gratefully acknowledge the Manahoac peoples on whose ancestral homelands I live, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home in the Washington, D.C. area today. This presentation will review the recovery efforts for the collapse of a National Air and Space Museum collection storage building after a large snowstorm and the positive steps that the Smithsonian took to improve collections emergency preparedness following the event. Before I get into the heart of the presentation, here are a few quick facts about the Smithsonian, which was founded in 1846 and is composed of 21 museums, 21 libraries, 14 research centers, the National Zoo, and Smithsonian Gardens. And there are over 13,000 permanent and temporary staff that support collection stewardship in various roles. We deal with some very large numbers here when it comes to our collections, and after 175 years of collecting, we are now the caretakers of 157 million objects and specimens, ranging in age from parasites to the Concorde aircraft. In addition, we have a significant number of archives and library materials. We hold these items in trust for the American people, and these items represent our cultural heritage, spanning from the depths of the oceans to the outer reaches of space. And for a little more context, the National Air and Space Museum, originally the National Air Museum that was established in 1946, the main building in Washington, D.C. opened in 1976. And in 2023, the museum welcomed 2.1 million visitors, making it the 4th most visited museum in the United States and the 11th most in the world. The museum holds in trust over 80,000 artifacts and more than 20,000 square cubic feet of archival materials. I joined Air and Space in 2000 in in the collections department, and then the National Collections Program, or NCP, in 2016. The last location listed on the screen, the Garber facility, will be the focal area for this presentation. The Garber facility is a storage and former conservation and restoration facility for air and space. It was named in honor of a Smithsonian curator who, as a child, saw the Wright brothers fly and later joined the Smithsonian in 1920 to devote his 72-year career to acquiring and maintaining a national collection of complete air and spacecraft, artwork, memorabilia, uniforms, and many other item types. Now that you have some context about the Smithsonian and air and space, we'll get started on the main event. Although the Smithsonian is the steward of a vast collection, the feeling in the recent past was that we're covered in the case of an emergency. But in the wake of the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, the Smithsonian developed policy pertaining to disaster management, which focused first and foremost on human life, as it should. But a parallel collection-specific emergency program was not developed for some time. We'll fast forward to the years 2010 to 2012, when the Smithsonian experienced a series of unanticipated large-scale events in short succession, which are listed on the screen. Most natural hazards are listed here: snow, wind, fire, earthquake, and water. Each of these events brought the uncomfortable realization that the Smithsonian did not have the capacity to respond to large-scale emergency events in an effective way. This prompted several positive action items, which will be addressed later in the presentation. On February 10, 2010, Building 21 at the Garber facility suffered extensive roof damage due to heavy snow and high winds. Fortunately, no staff were in the building at the time. The building and property were not accessible to staff for the next week, and the extent of damage to the collections could not be determined during that time. While we couldn't get on site, NASM Registrar Natalie Redkin-Lee and I took the time to get onto our collections database remotely and started to create list of items in the building and a map highlighting high priority items that had been previously identified by curators. This 30 by 61 by 10 meter building held 3-dimensional artifacts and 2-dimensional works of art, 12 staff offices, including mine, and large quantities of archival supplies, tools, and packing and shipping materials. The 2-dimensional works of art were housed in a valley box structure inside the building and just out of view on the left of the large image. Most of the 3-dimensional artifacts were crated and stored on open steel shelving units or on wing racks along the back of the wall in the main building. Yes, those are aircraft wings on that back wall. On the right of the screen are examples of the type of artwork contained in the valley box. After the collapse, it took a few weeks for the design and engineering of the building reinforcements to be completed in consultation with structural engineers, NASM collections, facilities, and security staff. The map that Natalie and I created in those early days provided key information to the construction team of where to locate internal supports that would not inhibit the removal of collection items. During this time, recovery and rehousing materials were ordered, and triage areas were established in other NASM buildings on the property. Our first recovery mission focused on the framed works of art. We worked with our NASM conservation team to create a condition tag methodology, paper condition assessment forms, location tracking forms, and a digital assessment template in our collections database. When some staff were allowed to enter the space to evaluate the structural and object damage, this is what they saw. Building structural supports bent. Portions of the wall were blown out. What kept the roof from collapsing to the ground was the steel racking that held the air and space objects. Some of those compromised structural beams directly impacted both crated and uncrated objects, as you can see here with this wooden aircraft engine stand that was impacted by the structural support. And this red experimental hovercraft that became sandwiched between the black structural support, red sprinkler pipes, and the gray valley box structure on which it sat. Again, this is the box that contained the air and space framed art collection. During those initial weeks, the development of mold was our primary concern. The power was off, temperatures were rising, and water continued to pour into the building from the melting snow. Thankfully, the environmental control unit for the belly box was located outside the building. Auxiliary power was routed to the unit, a chiller was added to the ducting, and additional monitors were added, allowing us to feed conditioned dry air into the space. Even with 1 inch of standing water inside, we were able to keep the humidity around 50% and the air circulating. Of the 1,250 works that were eventually recovered, less than 10% had substantial mold concern. Through the diligent efforts of collection staff member Lars Macklemore, forging clear lines of communication with the construction team and educating them about our concerns, we were allowed to retrieve a sampling of items from the building 12 days after the collapse, which provided us with critical information about the state of the collections and helped us tailor our response plan accordingly. Conservation and collections management staff evaluated and began to triage collection materials that were recovered in this initial grouping. 26 days after the collapse, a choreographed team of 45 NASM conservation, registration, restoration, collections, archives, and curatorial staff, along with building engineers, contractors, and construction workers, removed all 1,250 works of art through a hole that had been cut into the side of the building. The screens that held the art were significantly compromised, as you can see in both images. Ordinarily, these screens would slide very smoothly on rails, but after the collapse, they were frozen in place, so a special device was created to extract the art that was more than an arm's length into the screen. This was the only 12-hour day of the entire recovery effort. All other days were kept to a standard 8 hours to reduce staff fatigue and the risks of potential damage to objects and equipment. By this time, all of our documentation protocols and techniques were in place. For items that received blue or yellow tags, which were dry and stable art, or art that was damp and needed closer review, they were sent directly to the documentation area in an adjacent building for inspection, condition surveys, and loose packing. Wet or damaged art received a red tag and was sent to our triage space in another building. NASM was fortunate to have 13 buildings on the property, some of which could be used as swing and staging space for this recovery effort. At the documentation area, artwork was assessed, photographed, and repackaged for short-term storage in another building on the campus. Damages ranged from flaking gilded frames and stained mats to torn canvases. Some items assessed during documentation were flagged for closer inspection by conservation and were sent to the triage building. Approximately 150 works were sent out for further conservation assessment and treatment. This is a screenshot of a NASM collections database record for one of the items assessed. It contained the date of the assessment, the color tag it was given, identifies it as having been impacted by the Building 21 collapse, and its condition report. This historical information will always stay with this object record. In the triage area, artwork was assessed by the conservation team. Art was removed from frames as needed, and those frames were tracked so that the art and frame could be reunited after treatment. Again, documentation of the items was critical throughout the recovery process. 29 days after the collapse, the recovery of the remaining 1,100 three-dimensional artifacts began, with cutting a very large hole in the front of the building through the inoperable roll-up door. This recovery effort continued through several campaigns until May. Because the rest of the building remained without power and was exposed to the elements, mold developed on many of the wooden crates and packing materials. The biggest risk to the structure was from the vibrations caused by noise, so the teams worked in silence and with only a quiet electric forklift. The structural engineer told us that there was no guarantee that the building wouldn't continue to collapse, even with the supports in place. So a tag-out system was established for my colleagues who volunteered to enter the building. A person would wear a tag and put their corresponding tag on a board outside the building. The structural engineer made an exception for us to enter this building at all, which, if it had not been a cultural heritage space, he would have just recommended that it be simply demolished. In addition to the oversized and crated items that were removed from the main part of the building, there was also aircraft fabric that had just recently been put into new and improved storage containers just before the collapse, of course. On April 26th, 53 business days after the collapse, we began working very closely with a demolition company, which is something no museum should ever have to say. But nonetheless, demolition began, even though the building contains several objects that were still inaccessible. These remaining collection objects were removed as the building was slowly demolished around them. To say this was a little nerve-wracking is an understatement. We worked very closely with the demolition team, and they were receptive to all of our requests and suggestions throughout this delicate operation with incredibly large machines. From this collections emergency event and the others I mentioned near the start, the cooling tower fire, earthquake, and superstorm, Smithsonian leadership determined that our readiness for these types of events was not where it should be. And from all these negative moments came some very positive actions. And this brings us back to a point I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation about steps that the Smithsonian took to improve its readiness and resiliency for collections emergencies. In September 2010, the Smithsonian launched a multi-year collection space planning project to document, analyze, and plan for addressing the institution's current and future collection space needs. 2.1 million square feet of collection space was surveyed, and the resultant collection space framework plan now serves as a guide for short and long-term facilities capital, real estate, and collections care projects. In 2012, the Collections Emergency Management Working Group was formed and worked together for 4 years to re-establish the Office of Emergency Management, which occurred in 2015, establish what became my position in the National Collections Program in March of 2016, create what became the Price Team in October 2016, and reevaluate Smithsonian Directive 109, the policy document that governs emergency management. Another initiative that ran parallel to the Emergency Working Group is the Climate Change Adaptation Plan Working Group. This group was tasked to study climate change-related risks to Smithsonian assets and consider adaptation measures, which clearly impacts collections and the work of what would become Price. I would like to share just a brief overview of our Central Collections Emergency Management Team and the resources the team has created for Smithsonian staff and other cultural heritage professionals. The Price program reports to the National Collections Program, and NCP is a very small central office at the Smithsonian dedicated to improving the overall stewardship of Smithsonian collections and supporting institution-wide collections priorities, including collections emergency management. Both NCP and Price encourage everyone to see themselves as collection stewards, regardless of their titles, departments, or specialties. As Sophie Rowe indicated during her presentation on the first day of this conference, Price also works in partnership with multiple groups across the Smithsonian beyond our collections colleagues, including security, facilities, health and safety, risk management, and emergency management. The Price team is composed of 7 collection staff members from multiple Smithsonian museums, archives, and libraries, and represents multiple disciplines, including conservation, preservation, registration, and collections management. Each team member is a co-lead of a Price action team, and those teams are logistics, policy and procedures, and training. The logistics action team works to increase the capacity for coordinated collections recovery in the event of emergency, acting as liaisons between resources and the museums, archives, and libraries who need them. To date, their projects have included a library of resources for working with vendors, such as statements of work for emergency events, a form for requesting assistance in an emergency, an app for hosting, maintaining, and sharing information about Smithsonian Collections emergency supply kits, and a process for mapping emergency incidents through GIS. The Policy and Procedures Action Team provides a foundation for staff to understand their responsibilities and have tools to plan and act on behalf of collections in all phases of the disaster life cycle. The team developed a collections emergency program template and an associated tabletop exercise to support staff updating their collections emergency plans. The team's recent efforts have been to research the effects of soot, smoke, and fire on collections materials at our fire salvage workshop. The Training Action Team hosts several in-person workshops and tabletops on collections emergency preparedness topics. These programs provide a safe space to learn, discuss, and practice hands-on skills with colleagues across the Smithsonian. We also provide a variety of independent training opportunities online. These trainings are available to all staff, and we encourage participation to gain knowledge of emergency practices and to build collaborative relationships with colleagues. The 2 main Price workshops are the May Day Water Salvage and the Holy Smokes Fire Salvage. The fire salvage is pictured here, which is done in collaboration with the fire research labs at the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives and the National Institutes for Standards and Technology. Many of the resources that Price has created are available on the National Collections Program website and are listed on this chart. If there's time, I'd like to highlight two of these items, the Promoting Exhibit Access and Safety, or PEAS, and the REACH team. Both of the groups noted on this slide include specialists in architecture, collections, conservation, exhibits, security, risk management, and visitor services from various institutions and organizations that connect to international, national, regional, local, and tribal audiences. This wide array of disciplines represents the various specializations responsible for and dedicated to the care and management of collections. PEAS is a specialty working group based at the Smithsonian that seeks to optimize public access, preventive conservation, and security to provide a safe environment for visitors and promote collections preservation. PEAS has compiled a bibliography of scholarly resources on topics related to emergency access and safety, and recently published a series of articles discussing multidisciplinary approaches. And we're looking for members to help continue this work. So if you're interested, send me an email. The second group I'd like to highlight is the Resources for Emergencies Affecting Cultural Heritage, or REACH working group, which had members from the Smithsonian, Library of Congress, National Park Service, American Industrial Hygiene Association, American Institute for Conservation, or AIC, and many others. REACH and the AIC Emergency Committee joined forces to create and disseminate a free online library of trusted, high-quality resources on emergency management for cultural institutions. And again, these are all available on the ncp.si.edu website. So that is my time for you today. I just want to acknowledge everyone who has helped out with the Building 21 recovery, the National Collections Program, and the Price team. And if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to take them at the next portion of this conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Samantha. And actually, stay here because we're going to do the Q&A now. So if I can get Diego, Dóris, and Ulrich to please turn on their cameras and their microphones, I'm going to start going through this enormous pile of questions for everyone. And I'm going to ask everyone to keep their answers to about a minute so I can try to at least get through some of these. But again, we'll have breakout sessions at the end of the day where people can ask additional questions and meet the speakers. So let's start with Diego. And Dóris, were you able to implement any preventive or mitigation measures before the floods began?
So yeah, there is no preventive action because there was no emergency response at that point in for the state. And of course, after all that happens, now that's under discussion. Not only the museum system in the state with the federal agency BRA are discussing emergency response to be prepared for new emergencies in the future.
Yes, I think we're seeing a lot with people not thinking these are issues to begin with when they do their risk assessment, and of course it moves up the list. Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to keep moving. Ulrich. So we have quite a few questions here about whether there were any signs in advance. Were there cracks in the building? Did anybody have it? And also, were they able to rebuild on that site? Were there any precautions? What about the buildings next door? A lot of those kind of questions.
Okay. In fact, we had very close monitoring of the building in the course of the underground building process. And there were even experts in the building like a few weeks before the actual collapse. And they were looking at cracks. Of course, whenever you build something, there are bound to be cracks. The question is, are those cracks that indicate that something is going to happen? And they were very sure that this was just the ordinary, they call it like the building is settling. So there were no cracks. And in fact, from what we know now, it is very, very likely that the cause of the disaster was a matter of hours before actually the building collapsed, because we know that in the morning of the 3rd of March, suddenly a lot of material appeared inside this underground construction site. So it hadn't been there before. It went in there, and of course, it caused sort of a cavity below the building. So that was a very short time of notice. And then, in fact, nobody knew about it. We were very, very lucky that two people in our building passed the threshold to the building just about 2 o'clock, and they noticed that there was a big crack in the ground, and they moved everyone out of the building. So that's why there were no major casualties inside the archive building.
Wow.
So it wasn't to be expected. If there had been any indication, of course, the building would have been evacuated at the first notice.
Right. Wow, thank you. Samantha, so as we were hearing from Ulrich in the Cologne collapse, having things in archival boxes or other kinds of boxes really made a big difference in how things were surviving. And this questioner is saying that is that the same for the created and uncreated? Did you see a big difference in the collapse, the storage spaces at Smithsonian?
Yes, definitely. I mean, things that were stored within those wooden crates or within some kind of, blue board, acid-free box or something like that, they did receive the protection that was necessary. But it was interesting to see how water always finds a way. And I think that any of us that have been through water incidents at any kind of facility know that. So even boxes that had appeared to be sealed, plastic containers with, lids that looked very sturdy, water still got into those. So that was an unfortunate, and you saw that in some of the earlier slides, is some of those in-process tubs that we had, those plastic tubs, just literally filled with water so that the items were floating in there when we took them out for that initial evaluation and recovery phase. But yes, absolutely, if you can cover it and protect it in some kind of container, that's always better. And it also depended on where the impact was in the building. So even if something was out on a shelf, if there was shelves above it, it was protected even if it wasn't in a crate.
Thank you. Dóris and Diego, can you talk about the role that you started to mention it, but of course we got a little crunched on time. Can you talk about the role that ICOM-Brazil played in the recovery effort and that how that communication and organization happened, how the larger ICOM community may have been involved? Can you talk a little bit about managing that and how you did that?
Well, yeah, we did work in a twofold way. First of all, for national side, I mean, we had this meeting, I mean, between ICOM-Brazil, the federal agency, BRA, and also the museum system from the state, which were able to coordinate action. So which part are we going to do any of the things that are assigned? So IBRAM was quite much involved in getting resources from federal government to the state, also some donation from some special donors and make the transfer, because I didn't mention because of lack of time, but of course all the infrastructure of the state were affected. The airport was closed, was just reopened kind of a month ago. We had several days with power shortage and water shortage. So even to get the donation that you need some involvement of military forces, air forces. So the federal agency was mostly devoted to coordinate governmental efforts towards the state. I was mostly involved on talking about with civil organizations, and that include not only national organization, but also international organization. So we get these 4 international committees to get involved, to know what was going on, and to be able to not only be available, but also to respond some specific demands. And we also were in touch with a specific international organization that can fund and donate specific equipment for this rescue and restoration efforts. So, but we had this assignment that everything we were done was going to be like arranged between all the actors, and we go through the local system of museums. So we don't have a lot of people acting locally. So even though we were acting like in parallel, everything will converge to Dóris, who was the person leading on the ground all the actions.
Thank you. Ulrich, so when the firefighters first started finding books and archival materials, Did they get any kind of collections handling training so at least they felt more comfortable, a little less scared handling the materials? Or how did you interact with those folks who were handling these things? You know, you couldn't get in there and do it yourself.
No, we couldn't actually, but we were very happy because the director of the fire department at that time is also one of the very active in research on the history of firefighting in Cologne. So he had been an avid user of the archives before they collapsed, which was very helpful because he was able to tell and to stress the importance of actually salvaging this material, not only to his fire department, his fire brigade, but also to all the professional people coming in to help from actually all over Germany. So our main idea was not so much actually to teach handling and actually more waste time by having people being very careful about what they do. We were very happy that the firefighters were actually ready to touch the material and then take it out. So it was a matter of actually moving a lot of material. And they were extremely happy. Whenever they found things, they would like show them to us and they'd be very, very proud. And of course, we were very happy for them to be proud to help us. So it was that was not very much of a problem. The damage that had occurred before was much more significant than what they could have done to the material.
Yes, and I agree that relationship with them and having them be excited and engaged as part of the recovery is more important, really, than anything else. Samantha, does that price training that you're talking about, does that include non-collection staff, or is that just for collection staff?
No, absolutely. It is for anyone who is staff at the Smithsonian, because we encourage our facilities, our security, our health and safety folks to be part of those trainings with us, and they have been in the past, which has been wonderful because for us, our facilities and security staff are like our first responders. So they're there in the evenings and on the weekends when we're not. So we want to build those lines of communication and collaboration with them through the safe space of our workshops and on the blue sky days, because we know that the dark days are coming and the rains and everything else will be coming our way. So we want to work with them so that, one, they know who we are. We can communicate with them when something bad happens. They'll say, I remember working with Samantha on this, and she said we should reach out. So let me go do that. And, we'll work together going forward. So they're always part of all of our trainings. We've designed some trainings in collaboration with those folks. Our health and safety team is always part of our discussions for our trainings because health and safety is at the core of all of our work. It should be because our PPE, health and safety, comes first as humans to each other, and then it's the care of the items. And also working with our security staff, most recently on developing a activist vandals response course for security officers and for staff, because activist vandals have been using cultural heritage sites to raise awareness for their causes. We understand, we get it, but we also need to protect our collections. So we worked with security to develop that course among several others. But yes, all are welcome. And those resources, again, are available on our site. So please modify them as they may work for you best.
And as a Smithsonian staffer, I will also mention that we are open to the public, and we are a place where people can protest and say things. So it's a very complicated situation for things like that. It's great that all the staff are being involved in that. So there are a lot of questions for everybody, but as I go through, I see something that is, I'm going to go a little off script here. I see something that is being asked of everyone. A lot of these collections we're hearing all through the morning are either stored in floodplains or stored next to ongoing construction that's underground the museum, or stored in buildings that may not be as sturdy as we would now build our storage buildings. For all the speakers here, and we'll start with Dóris and Diego and then do Ulrich and then do Samantha, has there been a change based on your experience now? Has there been a change for where things are stored? Have any collections really been moved during construction before it's going to happen? Things like that. Has that been impacted? So we'll start with Dóris and Diego.
So it's a very recent case in Rio Grande do Sul, but we have 2 museums that were relocated, mostly because of the original buildings were destroyed or permanently damaged. So they were relocated to a new place, which is also more is a safer place. But most of those museums are a lot of small towns, so they don't have a lot of possibilities to move around. So we do have situations of museums and storage that have been already identified as a bad place, but they can find a solution within this small town. So this is still under discussion. The specific case of the town of Musum, which have been flooded twice over the last 2 years, and the museum is still in the same place. They then don't have another place to move it, so that's still an ongoing solution. They plan to do some mitigation on the property, but this is still not going to solve it. But that's a huge talk just after the flood, not only for the museum sector, but how do you actually organize urbanization on those places which you know is going to flood? It's going to flood even more over the next years because of climate change.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Ulrich.
That was actually the key word that I was going to start with, climate change. I don't think you can do a lot about when you're planning a building. You cannot do a lot about construction work, maybe bound to start 30 years after, and that was the case with the collapsed building. However, we have had our share of floodings due to increased precipitation over the past years. So whenever museums, archives, libraries, any kind of heritage buildings are being planned, people are looking very intently on flood risks. So that's a very important aspect. And if it's not possible to move the building, then people will have to do something about mitigation of flood risks. So that's a change definitely over the past 10 years. But I tend to think that there are some kinds of catastrophes that is very hard to foresee and to prepare for. So I think I can pass it on to Samantha, right? So
yeah. Thanks, Ulrich. And I completely agree that we can only prepare for what we think we know may be happening, but there are so many unknowns out there, and especially with climate change. And I dropped a couple links into the chat to some resources related to the collection space changes that the Smithsonian has made that I alluded to in my presentation. And just to illustrate that one of the reasons why the Building 21 collapse occurred was that we were in the process of starting to move the collections off of the Garber facility property and into new and improved storage at a different facility near the Dulles Airport. But 2 buildings next to Building 21 had been removed and knocked down that apparently acted as a wind brace for the building. So those were gone. The snowstorm happened, the winds kicked up, and we saw what happened. So that's why not only the several other buildings on the property received those same internal supports afterwards, because the buildings they were all temporary structures that had been put up in the 1960s, 70s, that had way outlived their lives. So internal supports were put on those. The collection space framework plan happened. All of those spaces were evaluated. Most of the buildings the Smithsonian buildings that are downtown, the museums, are in a floodplain. So there's been an active effort to move collections that had been in the basement levels up or off-site into some of the new facilities that we're trying to build. But with everybody's budgets are a challenge. So Smithsonian is no different. We're a quasi-federal institution. So the money trees are not growing as quickly as we would like them to. But we're trying to build additional storage that is off the mall for the collections and have shared spaces between different museums, archives, and libraries so that specialized collections can be stored together in the climate that they are needing for their preservation for the long term.
Thank you, Smith. I think we've all learned the hazards of temporary storage, because temporary storage is never temporary. And a lot of what we've been hearing this whole week is the lessons we can only learn after something has happened, and it's so important to have forums like this where everybody can share what they've learned to help people to learn those lessons without having to go through the disaster themselves. So I want to thank all of our speakers from the Q&A from this section of the day.